This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Stephen Horwatt, who just increased his pledge amount. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 533 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, which is available now on Amazon.com. We had a great conversation about the book back in episode 500, so definitely check that out if you missed it. And today on the show we'll be discussing Season 1 of the Disney Plus series Andor, a prequel to the 2016 film Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. And this will involve spoilers for everything in the show, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up we've got Erin Lindsey, making her 34th appearance on the show. She's the author of the Bloodbound series of epic fantasy novels, and the Nicholas Lenoir series of paranormal detective novels, which she writes under the name E.L. Tettensor. The Silver Shooter, the latest novel in her Rose Gallagher series of historical mysteries, is out now. So Erin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's great to be back.
The next up we've got Andrea Kail, making her 27th appearance on the show. She's a graduate of the Odyssey Writers Workshop, and her short fiction appears in the Writers of the Future anthology, Fantasy Magazine, and Lightspeed. She's been a television writer, producer, and script supervisor for shows such as Late Night with Conan O'Brien, The Chew, and WWE's Monday Night Raw and Friday Night SmackDown, and she's currently a writer for Pixelberry Studios. So Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
And also joining us today is Matt London, making his 18th appearance on the show. He's the author of the Eighth Continent novels, a series of science fiction eco-adventures, and the interactive novel You Are the Classics, Treasure Islands. His short fiction appears in The Living Dead 2, Daily Science Fiction, and Space and Time. So Matt, welcome to the show.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, so Matt used to be our most frequent guest
At one time. Now I'm not even the most frequent on this episode. by a lot.
But it's great to have you back, Matt. Yeah, so the last time you were on the show, the last time was Rick and Morty, but I think the last time before that was Rogue One.
I think I was having an aneurysm about episode 7 the last time I was on the show.
So I have not talked to you about Star Wars since
in a while.
Rogue One. So I wanted to start on just what has been kind of your overall feelings about Star Wars leading into Andor?
Well, so I think maybe for context to start, I'm a lifelong diehard Star Wars freak. I read all of the what was once called the Expanded Universe novels, now the Legends novels, and was pretty deep into the franchise, just as like a passionate fan. Played a lot of the tabletop RPG, the Star Wars tabletop RPG, multiple of them actually. So it was a big part of sort of like my interaction with science fiction and fantasy from a very early age. But I think I should probably also say that, I'm not somebody who's precious about the franchise or territorial about it. I think that a lot of the things that have happened in the last, 10 years or so, that have really led to the franchise becoming more diverse, becoming, not just in terms of the people that are creating the series and starring in the series, but the kinds of stories that they're telling as well. I think that's great. I think it's, the galaxy is big enough for everyone. So I'm not one of those kinds of fanboys. But I do feel like basically everything that this series has done post Return of the Jedi has struggled to sort of live up to, people's childhood expectations of what what the stories are supposed to be, or what the franchise is supposed to be.
Well, let me ask you. I mean, just to give you an idea, I didn't like Force Awakens or The Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah,
I really liked The Last Jedi. I really liked Rogue One. I really liked The Mandalorian. But then after I just heard the Book of Boba Fett wasn't that good, and so I didn't even watch the Boba Fett or the Obi-Wan Kenobi shows.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen them all, and I think that there are definite differences in quality. I'm not particularly, I'm sort of take it or leave it about all three of the sequels. That series felt like it was like, sort of concepted in a boardroom where no one agreed with each other, and it shows on the screen. So I don't think about them. I don't think about them very much. But that does sort of free me up to absorb each new piece of content independently of anything else in the series. And I've enjoyed doing that because it's helped me kind of connect with new characters, like in The Mandalorian. I think that both Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan had some really cool things about it. Seeing some of these actors from the prequel trilogy come back and get to, work with new writers, get to work on new kinds of stories, revisiting some of these old characters. Really, really cool to see. Even if, some of the pacing in them to me felt a little uneven. And then, now Andor, to me...
Wait, let's not get into Andor just yet.
Okay, well, anyway, I was going to say that there are good things about these series, but, they have been sort of hit or miss.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get Andrea in here too. So Andrea, one reason I wanted you for this panel is because I think you said in a recent episode that Rogue One was your favorite Star Wars movie. Is that right?
Yep, 100%. And I will die on that hill. I know some people don't like it for some reason, but yes, absolutely 100% think it is the best. I mean, childhood nostalgia aside, I will always love the original Star Wars. But just as an adult, and I think it is because I'm coming at Rogue One as an adult, it's my favorite Star Wars movie because it's Star Wars for adults. It actually is about war and the realities of war. And I know you like Last Jedi. It did not hit me well, specifically because it still felt like a kid's movie to me. Rogue One blew all that away. Rogue One had real characters and real situations that shows the price of war. And that is why it's my favorite. And not even just my favorite, but I just think it's the best one because it's real. It's about real situations and what happens in war and the sacrifices you make. So that is my stand on Rogue One.
Mm-hmm. And so how much Star Wars stuff had you been following the last few years? Had you watched Mandalorian, Obi-Wan, any of that stuff?
For some reason, I didn't. I watched like the first couple episodes in Mandalorian, and I don't know why it just didn't hit with me. I did watch Obi-Wan and was not happy with it for very specific reasons. Those reasons being, I hate spunky little girl characters. It was a kid's show, and I wanted that kid just drove me crazy. And I'm sorry, like, and here's where I'm also, again, coming at it from, I'm an adult and I have experiences. And, the thing about Leia is she's a smart woman. And the child that they portrayed is a spoiled little girl who goes running off because she wants to. She doesn't want to do, what she has to do. And in the process gets a whole bunch of people killed. And that is never addressed. And she's just this cute little girl and everybody's supposed to love her. I'm sorry. She's a spoiled child who got a bunch of people killed because she didn't want to go to some thing with her parents. And it just drove me crazy. And she's walking through the whole show going, spin me, make me float. What the? I'm trying desperately not to say the word fuck, but there you go. It absolutely drove me crazy, made me actually angry. When you have this much money and also a great cast, and then you put as your center character a spoiled child, and that makes me crazy. And that's where I think Disney screws this whole thing up. And, you know, and I'm not going to start talking about Andor, but that is so much different. And I'm shocked that Disney put out this show, because it's not a kid show. And I'm saying that as a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I have been saying, if you can go back and listen to all our previous Star Wars panels. I mean, I've been saying for years that what I want is, you know, Star Wars for adults, you know, like that's dark and it takes itself seriously, that isn't full of fan service and jokiness, you know, and so even the stuff I liked, you know, like The Mandalorian, I mean, I said, like, this is a great, nostalgic, fun throwback to old time television kind of show. And if you're into that, which I, you know, in this case I am, like, it's very enjoyable, but it's not 100% what I want. What I want is, like you're saying, the Star Wars not for kids.
Right.
So maybe that will give people an idea of how I responded to Andor. But I want to get Erin in here too. And I know a lot about how Erin feels about Star Wars because she was on all our Solo panel and Mandalorian panels and stuff like that. But Erin, is there anything else to add to what we've said already about sort of how you were feeling going into Andor, what your expectations were?
Well, in fact, I had no expectations. Well, that's not entirely true. I had no intention of watching Andor. And I had no intention of watching it because I am hot and cold on The Mandalorian. I did not enjoy the Book of Boba Fett. I didn't dislike it, but I just found it, you know, quite dull and grainy. And I had heard nothing good about the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. And I thought, okay, well, I'm kind of done with this. And I just don't think I need to put myself through another one of these Star Wars shows that has me rolling my eyes for most of it. So to the extent that I had any expectations, they were set by you, Dave, when you reached out to me for the panel and you said, and I think it was just in its entirety, it's good.
It's really good.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. It's definitely worth watching then. And I really can't thank you enough because I wouldn't have watched it. And I'm so glad I did.
Yeah. And actually, I can't thank enough our listener, Rory Carroll, who was on our Netflix Dark panels. Because I had no intention of watching this. I mean, it's not like, and I liked Rogue One, you know, a lot, but I just thought the idea of a casting Andor show.
I liked it too, but it wasn't memorable.
Yeah. I mean, you can, if people are curious, you can go back and listen to our panel on that. And I mean, I had a lot of thoughts about it, but I mean, overall, I thought it was in like my top 3 or 4 probably of Star Wars movies. But even with that, it wasn't like I heard that they were doing an Andor. I think originally it was a movie. I forget, but or maybe it was a show from the beginning. But when they said there's going to be an Andor thing, I'm like, it's not. I was like, this just seems desperate, you know. Like, do we really need a prequel to a prequel of a character? This is like very minor character, you know. And I was a little overdosed on Star Wars, and I'd heard that Obi-Wan and Boba Fett, those shows weren't good, and so I didn't watch them, and so I really had no intention of watching this at all. And Rory Carroll messaged me and said, like, you got to watch Andor. It's so good. Like, he really sort of twisted my arm to watch it. And so I said, all right, I'll watch it, you know. And I started watching the first episode, and I ended up watching the entire season in one day. You know, I never paused it to, you know, check my email or take a nap or anything. You know, it was just like nonstop, beginning to end.
Yeah.
Totally engrossed the entire time. So that's my experience with Andor. So Matt, what were kind of your initial impressions of this Andor show?
I mean, it was immediately so different in terms of the cinematography, the pacing, the writing. The writing is so good on this show. There are scenes and monologues and the kinds of language that you would just never expect to hear in a like a mass market piece of sci-fi content. I don't think. It's striking, and I actually thought a lot about the showrunner Tony Gilroy's film Michael Clayton, which is a great little movie, and because that movie is also kind of about trying to make a difference, the banality of evil, murderous corporations, and but the aesthetic of it is it has very quiet pacing, even though there's just this undercurrent of menace. And I felt like from the jump, the Andor show captured that quite strikingly. So it immediately felt different. Like all of my sort of like author buzzers were going off. It just felt like this is craftsmanship that I'm not used to seeing on TV.
Yeah.
It's filmmaking.
Yeah.
It's filmmaking.
I'll just say, like, if you're listening, if you haven't watched the show and you're just listening to this to see like, oh, is this something I should be interested in? Yes, 100% it is. And I would definitely recommend going and watching it before listening to the rest of this spoiler-filled discussion. Yeah. So we can just get that out of the way.
Pause it. Go watch 14 hours of TV uninterrupted like Dave did. And then come back.
And I'd like to add that it's not just good in the Star Wars universe. It's good overall. You do not have to be a Star Wars fan, I don't think, to watch it. It's just gripping as its own thing, which I think is a hallmark of a great show. You don't have to really love Star Wars or be a fan. It is its own. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to build on that and say, I don't think you even really have to love sci-fi. I think if you like spy drama, if you are interested in revolution, if you are interested in empire, if you are interested in, geopolitics in that sense or history in that sense, this show has a lot to offer. And it's not just Star Wars for grownups, it's sci-fi for grownups.
Yeah, 100%.
To me, it had a lot of the same elements as The Expanse in terms of complexity and nuance. But it was done to a quality that The Expanse didn't always manage to hit. It did sometimes, and then other times fell short. And this was it's got all of the it's got the top quality acting and the top quality sets, and the costumes blew me away, and all the sort of bells and whistles that you're used to from Star Wars, but for once with a meaty, juicy story behind it that would have been good set in any universe. Yeah,
absolutely. So let me just say who Tony Gilroy is. So he's been a screenwriter in Hollywood for 30 years, starting off, as far as I can tell, with The Cutting Edge in 1992. And he's worked on a lot of high-profile projects: Dolores Claiborne, Proof of Life, Armageddon. He wrote all the Bourne Identity movies. And he wrote and directed The Bourne Legacy. And as Matt mentioned, he wrote and directed Michael Clayton, this movie with George Clooney that won all sorts of awards. And his connection, and he's not a Star Wars fan. I mean, he's been pretty blunt about the fact that he was never really into Star Wars, not that interested in it. But they brought him in when Rogue One was kind of floundering, and he kind of came in and was kind of the people say he was sort of the uncredited director. I mean, they reshot a lot of the movie, and he's sort of credited with saving it, and so he had a lot of goodwill over at Lucasfilm due to that. And I think that that's part of the reason he was able to, that they kind of took a hands-off approach with this Andor show and just kind of let him do what he wanted. I think also because he wasn't using any really major characters, so they weren't as concerned about him, messing up one of the major characters.
I read somewhere that somebody said that the two shows, Obi-Wan and Andor, were both in production at the same time, and Obi-Wan was the one they were focused on because they thought that was going to be their big thing, and so they didn't pay too much attention to Andor, and that's what made it great because there wasn't a bunch of nincompoop
meddling,
people meddling, sticking their paws in there and screwing everything up, and it shows.
The IP.
Yeah, exactly.
It does really feel like it is told from a single voice. That there's this unity in the storytelling, and that none of the set pieces feel out of place in a way that I think is hard with a big budget mass market show. But at the same time, you mentioned that Tony Gilroy is not the biggest Star Wars fan, but there's somebody on the writing staff that certainly is, because there are some incredibly deep cuts that are sort of throwaway lines in the show that harken back to, like super obscure lore arcana from Star Wars past, ancillary products and things like that. Even just like dwelling on Mon Mothma's Chandrillan heritage is pretty remarkable. That's like, Chandrilla is a planet that's been floating around since maybe the A New Hope novelization, back in the 70s. So, incredible to see how it feels both really disconnected in some ways from the majority of the Star Wars canon, but in other ways, it's like there are those crumbs for sort of like really diehard lore fanatics.
Yeah, I feel like he might have become more of a Star Wars fan in the course of working on this show, because if you listen to interviews with him talking about this show, he's obviously so excited about this show and just ecstatic with how it came out.
It's interesting. I wonder also if this might not be like George Lucas's favorite piece of Star Wars material, because like there's a lot of politics in the original conceit. There's that meeting that's alluded to and quite dramatically in Andor, this meeting on the Death Star in A New Hope, where there's this this ring of suits and they're all bickering with one another, and Tarkin and Vader walk in and kind of quell the debate, and they're talking about dissolving the Republic. They're talking about the Emperor assuming more direct control, right? It's like that boardroom is not new to Star Wars. But at the same time, there's some things in the show that feel to me really different from what you would expect. There's almost no aliens, very few space battles. Now, are those important for telling a good story? No, but to me at least, they're things that say like, hey, this is a Star War. This is something that you can't do, that you don't do in other big sci-fi franchises in quite the same way. There's a very specific aesthetic to it. And
also,
I did feel like some of that was missing.
Let me just say also, there's no mention of the Force. I don't think the word Force is used in the entire
Jedi
season.
No Jedi. Yep.
Yeah, and it's funny. I may, during the course of this conversation, reference several quite brilliant Twitter takes. I don't have all of those tweets at my fingertips, so I apologize if I'm not attributing things to people. But yes, somebody I remember called out while the show was airing that like, I wonder how these like salt of the earth rebels felt about a bunch of like religious fanatics with superpowers co-opting their rebellion for their own family feud. And it's like, I actually do feel more empathy for the people that are getting pummeled in this show than any of the sort of sweet epic heroes of the main canon.
Well, I felt like, when the story is focused on the Jedi and the Empire, it's like, the two big, the knights, the king and the knights and that kind of story where it's focused on the royalty. This was about the peasants. And I think that is an important story to tell.
Right. Well, the question I think the show asks is, how do you get out of a totalitarian dictatorship?
Yeah.
And the answer that Star Wars gives you is magic. Magic is how you get out of a totalitarian dictatorship. This show says, no, it's us. We're the only way that we can get out of a dictatorship. And it's a very different message, right?
It's got a much more nuanced view of us. And so, yes, the peasants feature. But what I like about this, particularly as a student of politics and a student of revolution, it's not just the people in the trenches. You're also seeing how there are key pieces necessary within the elites and within the apparatus itself that are essential to a successful overthrow of tyranny. So you've got Mon Mothma, who's a diplomat. She's an ambassador. She's right in the middle of that sort of decadent rubber stamping elite that is happening on Coruscant. You've got, we don't really know what the story is behind Luthen in terms of his background, but you've got this guy who's also part of the elites, the cultural elites in the capital. You've got people who are embedded within the ISB, which is basically the internal security bureau of the empire. So there are also people at the level of political and security elites who are key to making this happen. They're actually the ones moving the pieces around the board. And I think that's a much more nuanced view than this idea that it can only be accomplished by sort of a scrappy rabble at the grassroots level, because we've seen in terms of history, and we see all the time how that's not enough. It's essential, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I think as much as there's clearly some Star Wars fans on the writing team, there's also people on the writing team who are students of spy novels like John le Carré, and who are students of politics and students of history, who are really looking at how revolution has happened here on Earth and what that looks like.
And people who understand history and how empires build. Because
Exactly.
Looking at it, you can see the bits and pieces of the Nazis and the Roman Empire and how they conquered. A lot of it's in there. These people knew history and they used it.
And also what the front lines of imperialism look like, including now. Mm-hmm. There were, as a UN person, I have to say there were a few exchanges in the Mon Mothma storyline, well, not just hers actually, that were cringingly accurate. And just, I'm very curious about actually who's on the writers' team and what their backgrounds are.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear more, Erin, about, what you thought of this show based on your UN experiences. But I just want to set up what the story is, if anyone listening doesn't ignored my.
You're saying we got ahead of it a little bit here.
Yeah. Ignored my spoiler warning. But so the main character in this is Cassian Andor, who we see and who dies in dramatic fashion in Rogue One. And so we basically trace his journey from a child growing up on this planet Kenari, where he's part of this sort of like tribe of lost boys kind of kids who somehow ended up stranded on this planet. And he gets taken in by this woman, Marva, right? And raised on this planet called Ferrix. And then in the present of the story, he's traveling around looking for his sister who he was left behind on this planet and who he hasn't seen since they were kids. And he ends up being involved in sort of recruited by forces of the rebellion to engage in a big heist. And then he gets he gets thrown in prison, and there's a prison break kind of situation. So that's the Cassian Andor story. And then there's all these other characters that people have mentioned. And one thing I thought was interesting about this is I felt like the secondary characters, the show is called Andor, and he's in any other show, he would be a really interesting character. But in this, I felt like he was almost overshadowed by all these secondary characters and bit parts, all of whom were just absolutely fascinating to me. So I'm just curious what people think about that. Did the secondary characters almost interest you more than the ostensible hero?
They do, but I personally am okay with that. If I trust these guys, these writers enough to play the long game on this one. And if season 1 has Cassian as kind of a reactive protagonist who's just sort of being buffeted by the forces around him, I suspect we'll see that change. And I have a lot of patience for that. It irritates me actually in storytelling when our protagonist starts out completely chock full of agency, tick. Driving the story, tick. Because I don't think real life often works that way, particularly when you've got a hero who doesn't have superpowers. They have to sort of find themselves in this maelstrom somehow. And so I have a lot of patience for, especially with the subtlety of the acting that Diego Luna brings, and in parentheses, the acting on this show is incredible. particularly in comparison to the other Star Wars shows. And I think part of that is the performances, but undoubtedly a huge part of that is the script. But anyway, so he's got this sort of subtlety and this very sort of quiet, expressive way about him. And I think I'm waiting for him to pop, and I think it's deliberate rather than accidental.
I agree with that 100%. He spends the whole show reacting to everything. And then at the end, he makes that decision. You watch him make this decision. The last thing I wrote down as I was watching the final episode was, this is like the best origin story of all time. You know?
Yeah, they have that I use this phrase a lot, it turns out, narrative patience, where they actually give you, like, rather than, and I have to say that for me, that very first episode, the first half of that first episode, I was kind of like, oh God, I wasn't sure. And because we kick off with a flashback, which I have limited patience for in general, but also seems to be very popular in the Star Wars shows. They do a lot of storytelling through flashback. And it can be quite effective in limited doses, but I think they over rely on it. And then they do a flashback to this incredibly overused device of the idyllic hunter-gatherer society that's, endures some sort of horrible thing at the hands of either a, evil corporation or the Empire or both. And while I totally acknowledge that's been a huge feature of the history of Empire, it's been done so often, that Avatar storyline, and rarely is it done well. It's always done in a way that's so two-dimensional and simplistic that to me it's kind of offensive to everyone concerned. And I was so afraid that that's where we were going with this. And I was really, really glad that they didn't go that route.
See, Matt, I want to get Matt back in here. So, Matt, what did you think of all these characters? Like,
yeah, I mean, similarly, I think that you put a good script in the hands of a great cast and you get magic. There's a lot of classically trained British actors in this cast. And it shows. There's a technicality to the performances that I think is really remarkable. I think that the whole supporting cast, whoever's on screen is the person stealing the show. And in some cases, I think particularly about like Kyle Soller, who plays Cyril Karn, and Denise Go, who plays Deidre Miro, the inspector, right? Those two have a really tough, it's very challenging to deliver that kind of, deliver a character that is going to be unlikable without it being like mustache twirling.
Yes. Yep.
And I wouldn't say that I ever felt empathy for them, but definitely was captivated by them and appreciated just how, the level of subtlety it takes to build that kind of disdain in an audience can only be next to impossible to execute. And I thought that they both did an incredible job. There's so much subtext in the dialogue of Andor. There's so much communicated in the silences. There's whole romantic relationships communicated in silences in the show,
Yeah.
And it's,
I am not shipping that.
It's really, well, I was actually not even, I wasn't even talking about the two of them, but that's really, really gross. But yeah, I mean, it really, really standout performances.
Yeah.
I think my favorite kind of under the radar performance in the show is Catherine Hunter, who plays Cyril's mom.
Oh my God.
I mean, this is a woman who not only stole every scene that she was in the HBO series Rome, but also absolutely is the best part of the Joel Cohen Macbeth movie that was released recently. She plays all three witches. And then on the London stage, she's played Richard III and Puck and all of these sort of classic Shakespearean characters. So even though it's this very small part, you can't help but hang on every word that she says.
Well, let me say about those two characters, Cyril Karn and what was her name? Deidre
Miro. Yeah.
Miro. Those were my two favorite characters in the show, and these are sort of villains. They're agents of the Empire.
Yeah.
But they're portrayed so well, and I can't even think of a character like Cyril that I've seen before, where he's this, sort of really like fastidious, uptight, like huge chip on his shoulder because he's been raised by this overbearing mother who puts him down constantly, and he, takes the mission really seriously. Everyone is always goofing off, and he's trying to always get them to do their jobs, and doesn't fit in with with his coworkers.
Yeah, he's a total drip. I mean, the two characters from like pop culture that come to mind immediately, not really pop culture, but from mass media that come to mind for me are Inspector Javert from Les Miserables, and Detective Exley from is it Exley from LA Confidential?
That's the Guy Pearce character.
The Guy Pearce character.
Yeah, the Guy Pearce character.
So those I see both of those characters in him in a lot of ways, and I think actually it's like you see both sides of it, right? It's like I think that's where, if you were to find empathy, I think that's where you would find it in the those two characters. Like one of those is absolutely the villain, the other one's portrayed more as a unlikely hero, but in both cases I think that there's a lot there are echoes there. I think that for me personally though, like I could see how normally, and maybe even it was the intent of the storytellers here for the show to build that kind of empathy for the character, but I think that in the current global climate in 2022 2023, just impossible for me to go that far.
Let me just say, because I did have a lot of empathy for Cyril in the scene where he like sort of goes, his boss tells him basically don't get involved in this, and he completely disobeys and goes out, exceeds his authority to try to solve this murder, and ends up completely fucking everything up and getting a bunch of people killed. Yeah. And he's standing there over the flaming ruins of this bombed out car.
Yeah.
And it's just like Luke. To me, it was just like Luke looking at the burning, moisture farm on Tatooine. Like, this is his origin story. This is the wound that's going to drive him for the rest of his life. And
but it's a self-inflicted wound, which is more interesting.
And that's how he processes it. He processes it like a raging narcissist. It's not, what have I done, these poor people? It's, oh no, my career is going down in flames.
Yep. Yeah, you can see it in his face.
And his whole thing is this drive to prove himself. But he's an interesting character, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of him. I have, for me, in terms of the sort of secondary characters that stand out, I have to say Andy Serkis blew my mind in this one. I've seen him in so many things, and he's always good. One of the things that makes him good is often how over the top he can be. And there is a subtlety, a heartbreaking nuance to this performance that I have never seen from him, that I had never would have guessed he was capable of. And just every scene he was in, I was just riveted to him, just the small things going on in his face. And just the pain behind his eyes. And shout out to that, because it was an incredible performance.
Yeah. I think if somebody's going to win an Emmy on the show, it's going to be him. I don't even know if it's the best performance on the show, but I think that the stars are aligned, so to speak, that's the direction that they would go with the nominations.
But before we move off, I want to talk more about the Deidre character, who is the ISB intelligence analyst, who ends up going out into the field. So Andrea, what do you tell us about Deidre? What did you think of that character?
Every scene that she was in, and every scene that's in that, that boardroom, everything about that just screamed like, and anybody who's ever worked in an office, it's like the backstabbing office politics. And I felt this about every character on the show, is that exactly who they are. They're she is the climber. The one who thinks she knows better than everybody else, and she is right, but you can also see the downfall in her method. She's horrific, but also I know exactly who she is. It was. There's so many times I wrote down when I was watching this, like office politics, office politics, office politics. She's she's the ultimate player, who ends up also fucking it up at the end.
Right.
Yeah.
She gives Cyril so much crap for being a screw up and making stupid, reckless mistakes, and then goes out and makes the exact same mistake.
They're the same person.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. He's just a little more pathetic than she is.
Cyril, yeah. Well, and that's one of the reasons why in that last episode, when it all does come crashing down for her terror when she's almost torn limb from limb was really affecting, because it's the first time we've seen her lose that icy, calm, ruthless demeanor that she's had for the whole show, and she's physically shaking and she's come undone, and it's one of those moments where I really notice the quality of the performance too, because those two characters vie for the most punchable face on television. And it's nothing to do with their actual faces. It's really just to do with the performance and how you just want to punch them every time you see them.
That's kind of the point I was trying to get to before. Is like, it's really hard to execute that as an actor. Like, it's much easier to be an over the top villain so that the audience knows, like, oh, I'm watching a Greek play. I know this person's the villain because they've got the frowny face. It's like, no, in fact, to build that kind of subtle disdain to remind people of the terrible coworkers they've had in their lives.
Yeah.
That's an incredible talent. So major kudos to both writers and actors.
They take these characters and, we're talking about mustache twirling villains. These are villains, but we see why they're, we understand them, we know them, they make them real people, and we hate them, but we know who they are, and that's I think the key to it.
There was a description I heard once of a deep character, which is that this is a character who can do something that completely surprises you, but is completely consistent with everything that you know about them.
Yeah,
and the show is full of deep characters, and in so many science fiction shows and Star Wars shows, the characters are one-dimensional in the sense that in every scene they have the exact same personality, and you never see them in any moment that's different from that. And this, you see these characters in these private, vulnerable moments where you see different but completely consistent sides to them.
Right.
But they also have, and I think this sounds so obvious when you say it as a writer or as a critic, but it's not done as often or as well as it should be. They have coherent motivations. You understand what drives their decision-making framework. And so even when they surprise you, you can still see where that decision fits on their decision tree. You understand what has led them to make those choices. And I think what this show has done really well in terms of making those deep characters is, on the one hand, to Andrea's point, you recognize them from the real world. They are an avatar of something you have seen before, and that resonates on a human level. The other, for me, is I think they've done a really good job of understanding sort of who are the characters within a bureaucracy or within an imperial structure who sort of actually make the world turn. Because like any other structure, an empire is a pyramid. And so the emperor sits on top, obviously, but what makes a government of any kind work is the technocrats and the apparatchiks and the bureaucrats. And they have a variety of different motivations. And one of the things that they've got two characters who showcase very clearly is the degree to which personal ambition is the sort of the be all and end all of motivations for these characters. What I hope we see going forward is at least a couple of characters who are doing the wrong things for the right reasons, because imperialism was overwhelmingly a project that was enacted by a bunch of people who legitimately thought they were doing the right thing or contributing to the right thing, and their worldview was totally fucked up, and it was part of a value system that we reject now. Well, at least most of us do.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, well, not everyone.
Most of us do, or I at least hope most of us do. But at any rate, when you drill down to the individual level, it's a bit like religion, right? When you drill down to the individual level of the individual priest or the individual minister or whatever, you have people who legitimately think they're doing the right thing for for their family, for their society, for whatever.
I mean,
and they
so
end up
did
doing
you not
evil
feel
things in that name.
Did you not feel that was the case with Cyril? Because I got the feeling he was sort of an idealist.
I personally, my
But
take
it's still
on him
about
is that he's individually ambitious. He's out to prove himself
Yes.
for himself.
But he
has
does
no
believe
compassion.
he
has
does
no
believe
empathy.
in the mission of the Empire, though, right? I mean, he thinks they're doing that. He's
Yeah.
legitimately on that side, right?
There is that moment where they sort of like the two of them fan out over how much they love the Empire, right? It's like
It's true. But I guess what I'm talking about is people's like individuals' value systems and their morals. And, you know, whether it's bringing someone to God or civilizing the savage with order or whatever, you know, horrible, like imperialistic attitudes they brought to bear, these people thought that they were not only helping themselves and their society, but they were helping the societies that they'd conquered. Their worldview was so blinkered that they actually genuinely believed that. And I don't know that Cyril has even interrogated that. He understands how he fits into a system that works for him.
Yeah.
But to what degree has he queried whether that system works for the rest of the planets under the Empire's thrall? I haven't seen anything from him that suggests that he has.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's all about ambition for him. That's my complete take on him as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I also think that the show does a really good job of highlighting why Empire is bad also for the people who are benefiting from it. That like there's so much psychic damage happening to these Imperial officers. You can see it in like the way that they deal with things, or you know, get killed by rebels, right? Because their bosses want to make more money.
Yeah.
I think there is a message in that that I find pretty interesting and I think worthy of even more exploration, right? It's like, yes, even for Imperials, Empire is very bad.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a real element of that. Just having worked in offices my entire life with a bunch of characters, everything about these people was about covering your own ass. There was no feeling of like unity in what they believed in, other than my ambition is driving me and I want to cover my ass, and that's it. And that's every office I've ever worked in. There is no unity. It's about me.
Right.
I also want to bring in, as we mentioned, the Luthen and Mon Mothma characters. And another moment that, you know, of the kind I was talking about, where you see someone in this surprising, vulnerable moment that struck me so much, was where Luthen, who's this sort of spy master who's setting this rebellion in motion, and he's been acting for years behind the scenes, pulling strings, and he's finally about to, you know, set in motion this mission, which is going to attract so much attention that it's going to be the end of his ability to act in secret the way that he has all these years. And he's sort of sitting there waiting for the reports to come in, you know, kind of the night before, and kind of like, geez, like, what have I done? Like, is this really what I want? It's too late now. And just for a moment like that, for a character who up till then has seemed so in charge. Yeah.
The other one that I found really affecting for that character, and it was kind of almost a cheer out loud moment for me in terms of just the quality of the writing, was when he loses his shit with the guy he's got embedded in the ISB. The guy who's embedded in the ISB is really feeling the heat. He's upset because some of the people in the field are about to lose their lives, and Luthen's character is like, well, that's, you know, the cost of war, and yes, our brothers are going to have to take one for the team on this. And the guy from ISB says, you know, how can you be so cold about this? What have you sacrificed? And Luthen gives him a long and just absolutely devastating list of the things that he's sacrificed, which basically boils down to my soul. And the other thing that I really like about this is not only do you have some nuance on the Empire side, but you have nuance on the Rebel side, and you are seeing the kinds of horrible moral choices that they have to make and the very cold and ruthless choices that they have to make in order to be successful. And it is a study in the ends justify the means on both sides. Yeah. And that is also really accurate.
Yeah. That's what I felt through the entire show. Is there's everything in every other Star Wars is there's black and there's white. There's no crossover. Everything in this show is about moral ambiguity. It's about the gray tones in every single situation. And that's for me is feels like that's why this is an adult show. Nothing is black and white in the world. That were very few things or very, very few people. Everybody makes choices, and some of those choices hurt other people, but that's the way life is. And that's the way war is,
Yeah. And then you become a bean counter. You become a galactic bean counter of other people's lives. And it's just really, it's very cool to see. He actually reminded me a little of, I can't remember the name of the character, but, the character who plays the operative in, the character of the operative in Serenity, where he has that speech that he gives to Captain Malcolm Reynolds about how he understands very clearly he has no place in the utopia that he's building, that he's a monster and he needs to be a monster to get to utopia, but he has no place in that. And I sort of recognized a more nuanced version of that speech in what Luthen was saying, that that this I am not who I want to be here. I recognize that this is not the world that I'm working towards. It's just the only way to get there.
Yeah. I sacrifice my soul so that other people can live a better life.
Yeah. So I feel like we could
about that.
I feel like we could go on for 3 hours just listing everything that's great about this show. But so I want to move on from that and talk about, does anyone have any criticisms of the show? So Matt, do you have any criticisms at all of this amazing show?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind. One is that, so first of all, I love the way that this show kind of gets divided up into these 3-act little sort of mini sagas. They feel very contained. And the second of these trilogies is sort of the heist, right? The Imperial base heist.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, is some of the most tense television I've ever watched. And yet a vast majority of it is just people standing in the woods talking. And so my criticism is, now I'm going to have to tolerate decades of Star Wars fan films that are just people standing in the woods talking. It's like, oh, it's a Star Wars now. So that's one. The other.
Actually,
do you want to comment on that?
Let me pick up on that, because one of the few criticisms, or at least misgivings I had watching the show, was when there was the prison break. And I sort of heard Erin's voice in my head complaining about the obligatory prison break in every TV show. Yeah. And it sort of occurred to me that this is almost like this tracks the movie Solo really closely in weird ways. You have the reluctant hero who ends up joining the rebellion basically at the end. And along the way, he participates in a big heist and a prison break. And I was just wondering how people, if that occurred to anyone else, that this is sort of like Solo, almost like a really, really good remake of Solo, but tracks these sort of, it takes these real, it's executed really, really, really well, but maybe takes these sort of overdone things as its underlying structure.
It didn't occur to me personally. I mean, it definitely is the case that the heist is a box to tick and the prison break is a box to tick. But I don't have a problem with tropes if they're done well and you don't notice the seams. And I didn't notice the seams. They didn't seem like stitched on like a patch after the fact to add some extra action because we couldn't think of anything better. They did seem to fit within the story.
Andrea, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that Solo made such little impression on me that I was like, there's a prison break in Solo? I watched it. I know I watched it. I do not remember anything about it other than one or two things that I was like, well, this is the reason I hate this. Yeah. I just do not remember the story
like the droid uprising and the Wookiees in the cages that they free and stuff.
Vaguely remember the Wookiees. But yeah, that's how little an impression it made on me. I'm just kind of like, yeah, I sort of remember something with Wookiees. That's it. No,
I mean, fair enough. But so Matt, what was your second thing you were going to say?
I think that after the wire was pulled so tight for so long on the show, I think I expected more of a payoff in the final episode. A lot of and people are going to be like, what? There's so much incredible stuff that happens in the final episode. It's true, there is. But I think that there's messaging in the show that, you know, to defeat an empire, you kind of have to become a terrorist, and to defeat an empire, people are going to have to die. Like, there are going to be sacrifices. And so I felt like in some ways, maybe like in the spirit of realism, the body count should have been higher. It felt like even the suicide bomber survived, like a very strange beat. You know, Bix is traumatized, obviously, at the end, but gets out okay. You know, I guess I expected it to be more of, maybe I expected it more to be that this was going to be Andor's moment to be standing amongst the flames going, what have I done? Rather than for everyone to kind of just like win and escape at the end. And to me, it sort of feels like, you know, he boxes up his whole family and puts them on a ship and sends them off. And it's like, well, so they're flying to planet Mandyville, never to be seen again. And now we're going to have this, you know, more political intrigue and revolution in the second season. So I guess I kind of wanted, I would have been happy given that they've all, like, we already know how the story ends, right? Everyone dies in a ball of fire. Mm-hmm. So why are we holding on to some of these characters? Couldn't we give them more definitive conclusions? That was something that to me felt a little bit absent. And then as a, you know, another thing is that I did allude to this earlier, but the obvious romantic relationship between Mon Mothma's cousin and her partner, I felt they were really kind of beating around the bush with that for no reason, other than to keep like LGBT relationships off screen. That felt to me like, come on, guys, it's 2022. Let's like, this stuff can be text. It doesn't have to be subtext anymore.
Mm-hmm. Or it can just go away. Like, one of the two, do or do not. There is no try. This is kind of like, I wanted to see more of that relationship or less of it. Yeah. I would have been happy with either choice. Yeah. But it just seemed like they were ticking a box.
Yeah, it felt like there are some scenes between the two of them where obviously they've got some baggage, and I couldn't figure out quite what the disagreement was between with them. So I kind of wanted to dig more into that.
To me, it felt like the Val character was more into it, and the what's the other woman's name?
Senta
was committed to the cause. That's all she cared about. That relationship came second to her, and I think Val was upset by that, and that's what I think the issue between them was.
Yeah,
Val wants, go ahead.
So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say, I just think we're told that and we're not shown that. And I think it would be more effective if we had any investment ourselves as viewers in that relationship. But because we don't see any of it, Vel's pain that we're supposed to feel at her disappointment that her partner is not as invested in the relationship as she is, it doesn't really land because we're also not invested in it. For me, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with that. Andrea, do you have any other criticisms of the show that occurred to you as you were watching it?
I feel bad about saying this, but I kind of felt like it sagged a little, like in the second half. I think maybe it was because the heist episode, which Matt said was the tensest, really tense. I thought that was one of the most tense episodes of television I have ever seen. I was digging my fingernails into my palms as I'm watching it, and it's the whole episode. Like, it doesn't let up. And I think maybe after the high of that, things felt a little quiet to me. Maybe some of the scenes with Mon Mothma could have been cut a little, but I feel also that I'm cherry picking things to say about it. Overall, I thought it was just brilliant. So, that's my only.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I mean, like I said, I was riveted by the entire show, but I do feel like when I think back on it, the big heist is definitely the thing that is foremost in my mind, more so than some of the others.
The episode immediately after that, so episode 7, to me, you see this on a lot of other shows too. It's the episode that gets you from place to place. Like 24 was always really guilty of this. Like you've got 3 episode set piece, this 3 episode set piece, right? You've got the heist is, 4, 5, 6. You've got the prison, which is like 8 and 9, and then a little bit of 10. And it like there's this one bit in the middle. It's like, how do we get all these characters from where they are at the end of 6 to where they need to be in 8? We're going to figure it out in the next 45 minutes, right? It's like it is a lot of process and not a lot of drama.
Well, actually, now that you say that, because I have my list of things that, and these are all really minor, but pretty much all the things that sort of struck a wrong note to me fell right around that point, right? I thought when this is one of the guys who joins them on the big heist, this guy Arvel Skeen, all of a sudden he's like, let's just take the money and run and leave everybody behind. That seemed a little out of nowhere to me.
I love that scene. That scene.
All right. Well,
I really love that scene.
Put a pin in that.
Yeah.
When Cassian was apprehended by the K2SO style Imperial droid, that seemed a little goofy to me. Like,
yeah, agree.
And then the whole idea that Luthen wants Vel to kill Cassian seemed a little nonsensical to me. And those were really, I think those were basically my only things that struck a bit of a wrong note to me. But those all kind of basically came up around that time, the transitioning between the, coming out of the heist into the other stuff.
The 2 places that made me wrinkle my nose, I've mentioned one of them already, was that opening sequence in flashback of the hunter-gatherer society that Cassian is born into, for the reasons that I outlined. That I think it's a fairly sort of 2-dimensional portrayal. And what I don't like about that, and what I don't like about it in general, not just in Star Wars, is that it often treats these people as though they have no agency and no complexity. They're just kind of there to be a victim and to have something horrible happen to them. And so I kind of also wrinkled my nose during the religious ceremony that takes place during the heist that they use as the cover, because I kept waiting for, and one of the things that I don't know if it was just my settings, but you don't get any translation of what those guys are saying around the fire, right? It just says that they're speaking Aldani, but you don't actually know what they're saying.
Yeah.
That was a bit of an interesting choice, but I kept waiting for something to happen there. And that would have given them some agency and a role. Instead, they're treated as a sort of a piece of background. And again, they're not really given any sort of, it's just a very sort of 2-dimensional portrayal of something indigenous culture. And I would have liked them to give that a little bit more flesh. And what I kept expecting to happen and what I kind of wanted to happen was for our heroes' meticulously laid plans to be thrown, have a monkey wrench thrown into that by something that the local people did as an act of rebellion, because they seem to be setting it up, because the Imperial outpost, the commander of that, has this ceremony with the local population where they exchange sheepskins, and he's very contemptuous of that. And he, seems to think that they're really into these sheepskins or whatever. But as he walks away, the elder turns and chucks it in the fire and says something that isn't translated, but is clearly contemptuous. And I kind of was expecting them to stage an act of rebellion of their own, however modest, that threw a spotlight someplace inconvenient, or drew a spotlight from someplace inconvenient, or just gave them a role to play other than to jump up and down and chant in an exotic manner.
I guess it did strike me a little odd that they cast an actor as amazing as Bryan Cranston, and then he didn't have a lot to do in that.
Was it Bryan Cranston?
Wasn't it?
That's so funny, because I don't know. I said to my husband, I'm like, oh, look, it's space Bryan Cranston, but I wasn't being serious.
Was it?
Oh, I thought it was.
I don't know.
Maybe I'm wrong.
It certainly looked like him.
Scratch that if that's wrong. But well, let me come back to Matt though. So you said so my issue with the Arvel Skeen thing was that it just seems a little odd that he would have signed up for this basically suicide mission and pretend, and fooled all these people that he was a committed rebel this whole time, when all he really wanted was the money. I don't know. So but that worked for you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is surprising. And against everything that he's presented and the other characters are presented about him as a character. But of course, like he disables that criticism by, coming right out and being like, yeah, I'm a bold-faced liar. Part of me wonders if, there are people who get involved in insurgencies for selfish reasons, even if it is dangerous, sometimes because you don't have any other options. So, and like, it's not just like, so from that perspective, I thought that it made sense. And then once he was safe and once the money was in hand, then maybe he feels more comfortable coming out and saying, basically who he is for real. And the thing that I love about that sequence is Andor's reaction to it, which is like maybe is an Obi-Wan reaction, like original trilogy Obi-Wan reaction, thinking about how he just like cuts that dude's arm off in the cantina, but not a Luke Skywalker kind of reaction. And as I'm listening to the monologue from the guy explaining what he wants the plan to be with Andor, I'm thinking in my head, like, how does he get out of this? I have no idea what he could possibly. Bang, he's dead. Like, it's like that to me was so ruthless, and I like seeing that more ruthless side of rebellion, and it felt in character with some of the debates that Andor gets into with Jyn Erso in Rogue One. It's like he has this ruthlessness about him in that film as well. So seeing it play out, there's a few moments like that where he uses the simple solution, the Indiana Jones solution of just blasting the guy.
Yeah.
So it was compelling to watch that.
I think that it's, once again, we come back to the moral ambiguity thing. I kind of knew he was going to do it because and I think it's just because I knew the character from Rogue One. I think for that scene, what might have made it better, what might have made Skeen a better, more complex character, was that it was all true. His whole brother thing was true.
Agree. But then he changed his mind in the moment.
He took the opportunity. This opportunity presented itself, and I'm going to take it. And would have made a much more complex character there.
Couldn't agree more. Like it gets rid of the incoherence that Dave mentioned, because you can believe that he's invested 7 months eating roots or whatever it is they say they've been doing in the forest. He's invested all this time, and he really does have, he thinks he's working to a higher purpose. He's got revenge on his mind. He's got principles on his mind. He's been listening to his friend come up with this complex manifesto. And then when push comes to shove and that shiny thing is dangled in front of him, all of that disappears and he makes the mercenary choice. I think that would have been a gut punch for us to watch this character just lose it and be disappointed in him. And it just would have been a lot more effective. And you'd still get the bang for your buck in terms of the drama, because you'd still have the tension and you'd still have Cassian pulling the Han Solo under the table.
Right. And you see like a very real threat manifest as well. It's like, this is a challenge that the rebels are always going to have to deal with. It's like, how do you pay these people to fight a war for you? It's a big part of Mon Mothma's whole journey throughout the season is trying to solve that problem. And so you're seeing it at both at like the top end of how are we going to fund this thing, and at the bottom end of individuals that are in the trenches saying, well, what if my own personal profit is more important than your rebellion?
And you get that so often in actual rebellions. And you think about a place like the Congo, where you've got people who are nominally on the other side of a war, and maybe they thought, and maybe they really believed that that's what was going on at the beginning. But in the end, you have the insurgents and the regular army exchanging, gold or guerrillas or whatever it is that they're poaching to fund themselves. And they end up being on the same team, and it's the team of me.
Well, let's come back to Mon Mothma. I want to mention that. So I just Googled Bryan Cranston Andor, and apparently he is not in it, but there are a lot of people who think that he was, because the actor looks exactly like him.
He definitely, I knew exactly as soon as you said it. I had actually forgotten that I was like, space Bryan Cranston.
But so Erin, so you said that, I want to come back to the thing about your UN experience. You said that there were these scenes that just made you cringe involving Mon Mothma because they were so accurate to your experience. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, not just Mon Mothma. Actually, the one that made me cringe the most is the scene where, and I don't remember his name, but where the commanding officer of the Imperial outpost in Aldhani is talking to his superior who's visiting. They're talking about the local population in this very sort of sneering and contemptuous way, sort of making fun of their traditions. And then these, these ridiculous people, and they of course they think this celestial thing is holy, rolls eyes, and, they want goat skins and all this kind of stuff. And you still see so much of that. You see so much of it, not just like among, imperialist forces, but in you see that among diplomats. You see that among foreign aid workers a lot. And it's even people who think they're there to help, who legitimately believe that they're there to help, will have these moments of just being just contemptuous. And yeah, so that really did make me cringe. But watching sort of the performative quality of how Mon Mothma goes through her life, and sort of the empty theater of diplomacy in some ways, I really liked that storyline. I'm not sure how I feel about the storyline with the daughter, where that's kind of the moral choice that she has to make. But what she's doing in terms of putting on this show and investing so much in looking like the consummate diplomat and playing her role as an ambassador, while all of the real conversations are happening behind closed doors, definitely felt very accurate to me.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about
life in the embassy looked accurate.
There's this sort of subplot where she's moved all this money around to fund the rebellion, and now people are going to be looking for that money, and so she has to marry off her daughter to this crime lord to refill her.
Yeah,
get the money.
And the fact that she has to rely on a crime lord, I think, it really does feel, I'm not suggesting I've witnessed an ambassador rely on a crime lord, but I've definitely heard stories of that kind of thing happening. And yeah, the life at the embassy and the, parties and who sits where and why that's important, and how her husband is inviting people that she can't be seen with and all that kind of stuff. It's small. Mm-hmm. None of it amounts to much in the end, but it just gave it the right bells and whistles to feel genuine to me.
Mm-hmm.
And also defines their relationship, their very bad relationship going on between her and her husband.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The two choices that she makes in the final episode are actually, I think, one of the highlights of it. That, first, that she chooses to marry off her daughter to this crime lord, and then the other, that she basically sets her husband up to be the guilty party for the money that's disappeared,
which is brilliant. Yeah. But why did she?
Yeah, it is
both?
Brilliant.
I think that brilliant depending on how you feel about the husband. I mean, he's a sap and a loser, but he doesn't seem to me like to have a lot of malice in him. And, you mentioned earlier, Luthen's like kind of epic soliloquy about selling your soul for the rebellion. We see her starting to do that. I mean, she's doing it right before our eyes.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite deliberate that that Luthen is further along on that journey than Mon Mothma is. When you think about the context of the rest of this, of Star Wars, right? Mon Mothma is around and stays around. Luthen is not around. We don't know why, but he's not. And so in my mind, it adds a new and much deeper context to her character overall, to think that these were the very real sacrifices that she was making, not just like sacrifices of her family, but of her own morality, in order to power the goal, the true goal. And I'm reminded of like her vague line in Return of the Jedi that has captivated the minds of expanded universe authors for generations, of many Bothans died to bring us this information. Right? It's like
I kept thinking it through every scene with her. That was in my head.
Where are the Bothans?
Yeah. Who are the Bothans and why did they die? Right. But the truth is, like, it's funny when I see criticisms of the show, people saying like it doesn't feel like Star Wars. It's like it feels very Star Wars, It's like it's 100%. Always been about this. It's just the style of storytelling is really not the content. Yeah.
Well, and this whole concept of going over to the dark side. And, you know, as
Yeah.
you say, Luthen's farther down that path. Well, we don't know where he's going to end up.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Can I just say one more
Yeah.
thing, Dave, which is that, you know, thinking about the dark side here, right? Like it's all much more surface in most of the franchise, right? You literally see Darth Vader choking the life out of an officer before our eyes.
Yeah.
That's different from like Cyril sitting in that cubicle in a endless grid of cubicles, literally getting the life choked out of him, you know? It's a different way of telling the same. It's a more metaphorical way of telling the same story.
Yeah. Okay. So before
God, that was horrifying.
Before we run out of time, the other thing I really want to talk about is that, you know, this show is so much better than the other Star Wars shows, in my opinion. Like going from watching this, then I went back and watched Boba Fett and Obi-Wan. And it was like, you almost can't believe that the same species created both things. I mean, there's such a disjunction in quality between them. But my understanding is that in terms of ratings, the Obi-Wan show did by far the best, and then the Boba Fett show, and then this is trailing, you know, behind both of those. And
is that surprising in any way?
Well, and so go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you think it's a function of it being a Disney show, being on Disney and not being a Disney style show? There's no kids in this, really.
Well, what I'm wondering is like, yeah, what do you attribute that to? Is it something to do with this show itself? Is it that it doesn't have a recognizable character headlining it so much? Is it the fact that the other shows have kind of, you know, the people like me have sort of lost interest in Star Wars because there's been so many misses recently. I'm just curious what people's take on that is.
I think a combination of those things. Like if I think about my own experience, just from that very narrow prism, I wasn't going to watch it because of that. Because I had been disappointed in the previous ones, and maybe I would have tuned in if it had a headliner, although probably not, because I didn't tune into Obi-Wan Kenobi. And it's just it's not surprising, and it's the sort of the central problem of having these big IP things. It's a blessing and a curse, because it's what gets people to tune in, but then it comes with a whole bunch of baggage and expectations that in trying to service that, you end up delivering something that isn't of very good quality because it's built by committee. And I think, like, I hope that people will learn about this show and that they'll have a little bit of patience with it and let it build its audience. Because it seems to, I don't know, Dave, you would know presumably better than me what the buzz has been around it, because I've kind of deliberately not paid attention to that. Has it got pretty good buzz?
Well, the critical reception has been super positive. I think it's like 96% on Rotten Tomatoes. I think there's a contingent of the Star Wars fandom who thinks it's not it doesn't feel, like Matt's saying, doesn't feel enough like Star Wars. But one thing I heard is that each episode of this did better than the one before, whereas for the other shows, each episode did worse than the one before.
That makes a lot of sense. Because that's how I felt about, Kenobi Obi-Wan was just, I was like, oh, I kind of like this first episode, and maybe the second one, it's not so bad. And then it just, oh my God, it just slid down the hill of crap that it was built on.
I actually think that in some ways that phenomenon explains the dip in viewership of this show. It's coming on the tail of a number of Star Wars show releases, like kind of back to back. And, it's like any series, the third volume is rarely going to sell better than the first volume. So I think for some people it's just fatigue. I also think that it is kind of an acquired taste. It is a more intelligent and more literary show than a lot of the stuff that's on that streaming service. So I can absolutely, and it's not a criticism. I mean, I absolutely can see why some people would not be, would have trouble kind of like grabbing onto it. I mean, I'll confess, like in the first episode, like halfway through, I was like, I just want subtitles on. There's so many weird proper nouns.
Oh yeah.
It's like, I just want to be able to track what's happening better. And then by the second episode, I was like, I knew who all the characters were and I didn't really need that anymore. But it is not passive viewing. I think it takes an active mind to engage.
And it's
not for everybody.
It's not a kid's show, I don't think.
I mean, And that also explains, I think, why Disney may not have been so gung-ho about supporting it. Like, what action figure are you going to... It's the Bix Gets Tortured playset, Like, what are you going to sell?
I would buy that.
But yeah. But I would put that robot on a t-shirt. Like, that was a wonderful droid.
So expressive for just a stack of metal.
Yeah.
I cried. A droid made me cry. I mean, legitimately I was sobbing. What is that? What is that? and that's the fun character. That's the comic relief character. Right. And I cried. Oh.
Well, so I mean, that kind of makes me wonder. I mean, is part of the reason this show is so good is because, in a way, they took the easy route of not putting in the goofier stuff, the goofy aliens, the goofy force powers and stuff. And like, could they start introducing more of those things in an intelligent, literate way, or is it just impossible to take some of those stuff seriously?
Depends. It depends on what you mean by goofy. I think you can have humor without being goofy per se. I would like to highlight the example from The Mandalorian of the two stormtroopers arguing on the speeder bikes, which is, or is it? It is The Mandalorian, right? Yeah. The Taika Waititi episode, which is like the best scene in the whole first season, I think. But also there's a lot of Office style absurdist humor that you can bring into any bureaucratic situation. Bureaucracy is ripe for that. It's you could bring in a lot of humor that isn't necessarily goofy alien humor or goofy droids or whatever. That's more of the dark humor variety. I think there would be tons of space for that. And it's just really a question of making sure you put it in the right places in a way that doesn't give the audience whiplash.
And don't overdo it.
Yep.
That this continues to go back to my point of why I think Rogue One and this one are the best thing out of Star Wars ever, maybe, is that there aren't these comic relief characters making jokes, running around in the middle of a firefight, making jokes. It's serious. People are dying. Why are we making funny jokes? And I agree with you, Erin, that you can do, in that Office kind of way. But it can't be the point of a single character to be funny, because it just doesn't ring with me, No. That was my problem with The Last Jedi. It was my problem with The Last Jedi. I think that was the middle one of the sequels. It starts out with a freaking joke. And then they go right into thousands of people dying. And I was just like, there's like a tone problem here. And that was right in the beginning, and it kind of went downhill from there. And I know, Dave, you like it, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say is that, I mean, I've always wanted it to take itself more seriously and be darker and more adult and everything. But I mean, like, New Hope is about people cracking jokes while running around during a firefight. I mean, so, if someone says, like, this isn't the Star Wars that I know, I mean, that's kind of true in a way.
But you watch that as a child, and it's an epic, it's a, I don't want to say it's a kid's movie, but that's what it was. Han Solo and C-3PO and R2-D2, those are the funny characters. But that's a different movie. And this is a different and I'm an adult now. And it's fun to watch that in a nostalgic way, but it's not, it's not a serious, it's got serious parts of it, but at the end of the day, this is an adult show. And that's what I'm gravitating to as an adult person.
No, 100% what I want is a show that seems to me now the way that A New Hope seemed to me when I was 5, and it seemed very serious and scary and, adult when I was 5. But it's not.
But you were 5.
Action and great characters. But yeah, for a 5-year-old, yeah.
But also, I mean, I think there are moments in A New Hope. I kind of want to watch all of the Star Wars all over again before I make this comment. But my memory of it is that the humor got progressively goofier. as the franchise went on. And which isn't to say there isn't some goofy humor in A New Hope, because there definitely is. But there's also, I think there's all kinds of space and room for wry asides of the type that Han Solo makes. I think the best joke in A New Hope is when he tells, oh, no, wait, is it Empire Strikes Back? When he tells Leia he didn't have time to run it through committee. And it's just completely sort of an offhanded remark. I loved that. I think there's room for that sort of occasional quip.
I agree with you there. It's sarcasm. There's that kind of sarcasm,
which, as we all know, is the highest form of humor.
Absolutely. That's how I live my life.
I want to get Matt, like, what do you think, Matt, of this basic tension? Like, is Star Wars for kids or adults, or does it? I guess does it? I feel like I want an adult Star Wars movie, but some people don't, I guess, and that's legitimate. It seems to me.
I can't tell what people want anymore. People want to complain on the internet. I mean, that's really what it comes down to,
totally. Especially Star Wars people.
Everyone has their own internal barometer. Dave, I mean, I know that you and I we've been at big group dinners where we've had fierce debates about when Star Wars stopped being good, quote unquote, right? And it's like
hurtful things have been said about Return of the Jedi.
Exactly, and I
don't disagree with that.
I would die by that movie the way that Andrea would die by Rogue One, which I also think is great. It's like, so for me, it's really just like, I think there's this handful of mega franchises that are out there, right? Marvel, Star Wars, not many others, right? But as they get bigger and bigger, they have to open up to more forms of storytelling. You see that a little bit with Marvel movies, with like the Doctor Strange ones, a little bit more like horror, and the Ant-Man ones are a little bit sillier, and the Guardians of the Galaxy ones also have prison breaks and heists in them. And then, but then for Star Wars, it's also doing the same thing. And so I don't think that you need to feel like you're not a true Star Wars fan if everything that is Star Wars is not for you. Guarantee you there's some video games floating out there that are not for everybody. But then there's others that are really good. Some of them are very casual about their violence. Some of them are very serious about their violence. So it's, as they get bigger and there are more products, some things are going to be for you. Some things are not going to be for you. And that's okay.
Yeah. Well said.
Yep. 100%.
The galaxy, the universe is very big, and it doesn't vex me at all that there are different flavors of Star Wars for different consumers. I just hope that that Disney has the sort of patience to be hands off with this and let this show really continue to hit its stride and maximize its potential, because the temptation will of course be to go back to some of that more simplistic storytelling that that has been a hallmark of the franchise up until this point. And I think the debate that allegedly happened around the ending of Rogue One, where there was a strong pushback against the idea that everybody dies at the end. Rogue One was, in a sense, the sort of Big Bang, if you'll forgive the pun, of bringing in canon character death, or at least main character death, into it as the sort of ending. Like the everybody dies ending is not something I think anybody expected from Star Wars, and they've sort of broken the seal on that. And I'm not wishing for Game of Thrones level violence and darkness by any stretch, but I do think that there is room for this more political sophistication, and hopefully Disney continues to see that.
Yeah, well, there's apparently only going to be one more season of this show. That they had originally planned out 5, but then when they saw how large the scale had gotten, how many characters and stuff, they were just like, let's just do 2 and lead it into Rogue One and then wrap it up there. Which, like, on the one hand, I think is too bad because the show is so good, but on the other hand, I'm like, I don't want this show to overstay its welcome and
get bloated.
It might really go down.
Heist or
and
whatever.
And with the tag on the last episode 12, with the construction of the Death Star, like, how much longer can it go on? There's the clock's ticking on that story.
Yeah, but so then the question, I think, is, will Disney or will other Star Wars shows or other shows in general take a cue from this, and I think they will. I mean, Rory Carroll, when he recommended this, I listened to this podcast called The Watch, where they interviewed Tony Gilroy a few times and stuff. And on that podcast, they were saying that, they live in LA and they're screenwriters, the hosts. And they said every screenwriter in Hollywood is saying to themselves, like, Tony Gilroy is just taking this to a whole other level. He's so much better than everybody else. Like, we're just learning from this example. And I hope that's the case.
Mm.
Yep. There was this, it really was a how-to in writing and television production and directing. Everything I watched, I learned from.
And I hope it's not just the writers of other Star Wars shows that are paying attention. I'm looking at you, Rings of Power. The sort of the opposite of you take this big beloved IP that has all this epic stuff going on, and you start. I think it was Matt when you said something about how you start Star Wars. A New Hope starts at this very sort of nitty gritty level and ends up epic, and everything after that had to start from that epic starting point. And I think Rings of Power has really made that mistake in spades. And I think that's always going to be the temptation when you have these big box properties, is that you've got to be more epic. There needs to be more dragons and more explosions and more, more, and at the expense of resonant storytelling. And hopefully what these guys have shown is that you can take one of those big box properties and use it in the best possible way, which is that a universe that feels lived in, that feels three-dimensional and fleshed out, and then focus on the story and the characters from there on in. And the rest of it really is just cinematography.
Yeah. All right. So we're out of time. So we're going to have to get into some final thoughts. But yeah. Well, so how about Matt? What are your final thoughts on Andor?
Well, let's do the lightning round. So a couple more shout outs. Once again, Fiona Shaw crushing it. Fresh off of Killing Eve. I had trouble trusting her in the beginning, but managed to. I thought she did a really phenomenal job. Also shout out to Luthen's office assistant, who I think might be the real beating heart of the rebellion. I felt like she stole every scene that she was in, scolding him when he gets a little bit out of control. She's all about the mission. I really like that about her character. I really hope nothing bad happens to her. I don't want her to end up as a valuable lesson for Luthen in the second season. But actually, with that in mind, I was kind of impressed that not a lot of people got fridged in this series, which is a nice change of pace. Just a ton of really strong female characters. I think there's more female characters in Andor than in the totality of all other Star Wars.
Yeah.
So props again to the writers and the whole cast. It's like I really think that this show's set the bar not just for Star Wars but for all television. It's incredibly dense, but manages to still be very tense and exciting. So I'm really looking forward to more of this kind of thing. So my hope is that second season comes out just as strong. They stick the landing. I think it might be one of the greatest TV shows of all time. And then, Dave, before there was one other question I had. I don't know if maybe there's no time for this.
No,
but
go for it.
Well, so one thing I have seen come up, and I find this to be within the context of this sort of, we've talked a lot about empire today, and there is an irony in the fact that a giant litigious mega corporation is the funder and producer of this series. I don't know if that's worth talking about, but I find it compelling, and I've even seen some of my more bleeding-hearted liberal friends, sort of biting their nails, thinking about the contradiction here.
I guess, but who else is going to fund a $450 million TV show?
Exactly. Well, I'm reminded of all of the emperors and kings and queens who have funded art throughout the centuries. How many masterworks have been produced by the Catholic Church or by the the Medicis or Borgias or the Rockefellers and Westinghouses of their day. So yes, it has always kind of been the way that things get done. But I'm grateful at least that the show's out there and that it's it's coming at a very, I think, important time in our society. I'm glad that people are using it to start these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, and I guess one good thing about capitalism is that corporations respond to incentives, and so if the audience wants something, even if it's something that pushes a message that's counter to the interests of that big corporation, the corporation is going to do it if it's going to make them money. So, there's all gray areas and compromise. Life is full of gray areas and compromises and everything. But, if people want quality products that have thoughtful, intelligent messages, capitalism will provide that if there's a market for it.
Right. So they need to hurry up and work on that ISB Lego box.
Yeah, the torture play set.
Yeah.
For Andrea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please. I've got a lot of rage to get out.
Look, the floor, when you push this button, the floor of the prison set lights up.
Yeah.
Andrea,
push the button. Just keep pushing the button. I agree with what Matt said. It just as he was talking about the large corporations funding great art, it's like great art has always bitten the hand that feeds it. It's a lot of what we have today: Shakespeare, Greek plays, all of that. Good deal of it bit the hand, the hand that fed it. And I think that's a good thing. I think maybe some people don't realize that. They don't see the message, so they don't understand the irony or don't recognize the irony in it, which is sad. But, as he said, it's very timely. The march of the creep of fascism in this story is really what people need to see right now. And I hope they see that message in it. Just overall, I just want to say that the scenes between Karn and his mother are some of the tensest, messed up dysfunctional family things I've ever seen. And God, I want more of that. I so want more of that. But yeah, it's for me, the best thing I've seen out of Star Wars since Rogue One. And I really appreciate them making shows for me, adult shows that really show what war is like and really show what sacrifice is like, in order to promote and save liberty. So I can't recommend this show highly enough.
And Erin, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. Obviously, I loved the show. I have a wish list for season 2. It includes somebody, I want to see the imperialist bureaucrat who legitimately believes that they're saving the universe. And that, they see imperial overreach and they see some of these problems, but they argue that it's for the greater good. And they're trying to, do the right thing from within, and they're trying to civilize the galaxy, because I think that's a huge part of the imperialist experience. And I would like to see that poor misguided soul. I would like to see more of the Mon Mothma storyline. And in that storyline, I would love to see, so she's by the end of the season, made some very personal sacrifices for the rebellion. I'd like to see her make some political sacrifices for the rebellion. I'd like to see some vote trading in the Senate. Some of those dirty backroom deals that you have to sort of bite your tongue and get it done in order for your agenda to move forward. Because I think people have a hyper simplistic view of how politics really happens in the real world. And that it would be great to have a look at what it actually looks like. And then on the flip side, Cassian has made some sacrifices, but I'd like to see him make some more personal sacrifices in season 2. And this is a bit to Matt's point about that last episode. He hasn't had to pay the piper yet, really. The only real loss that he's suffered is the loss of his mother, which was through natural causes. And so it wasn't anything that was connected to the rebellion in any way. I'm saying in his adult life. Obviously, he's suffered some huge loss as a child that we only have a very fuzzy picture of so far. But I would like to see him make make the sorts of sacrifices that some of the other characters are making. So that's my wish list for season 2.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll just say again, I mean, obviously the show is incredible, and please just everybody watch it, spread the word about it, get your friends to watch it. You know, I mean, it's so good. It deserves a higher ratings than it's gotten so far. And I definitely want to see more shows like this. This is the kind of show that especially the kind of Star Wars show that I've been, pining after for all these years. So, please, let's all just give it as much support as we can. Okay, but let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Erin Lindsey, Andrea Kail, and Matt London. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Erin Lindsey, Andrea Kail, and Matt London for joining us on the show. This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.